Dr. Natalie Somerville taught for over 20 years in the Virginia public schools before moving to Atlanta, Georgia, to help in the care of her new grandchildren. And she, while there, opened a daycare center, a licensed daycare facility, so that she could craft the kind of early childhood learning experiences for her grandchildren that she felt were the best quality, really focused around their individual needs. And then when her daughter, who is a professor of psychology, clinical psychologist, ended up getting a tenure track professor position at the University of Richmond, the entire family moved back to Virginia, this time to Richmond. And at this time, her two grandchildren were starting to get kind of beyond daycare age into early childhood and school age years. And so Dr. Somerville created the Grand Magnolia School, a microschool in Richmond that's currently serving lower elementary school students. And again, focused on individualized learning, child-centered education with a real focus on individualized needs. So it's so wonderful to have Dr. Somerville with us on the podcast today. I had a chance recently to visit the Grand Magnolia School and to meet Dr. Somerville and her daughter, Dr. Pfeiffer. And it's just great to be here. Thanks, Dr. Somerville, for being on the podcast.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I appreciate it.
Well, it's great to have you. I'd love to start with your story of being a public school teacher in Virginia. You worked in several school districts across the state. And I wonder why you got into teaching in the first place.
That's an interesting question. I was a technical writer as a parent, and I found that the demands on me professionally and as a parent conflicted with each other. And I wanted to provide my children with a loving learning environment. So I started substitute teaching. And they told me, the principal said, you seem to enjoy this. Why aren't you a licensed teacher? And so that's when I started the process of my licensure. So I started teaching in order to be able to spend quality time with my children. I was off when they were off, and that worked out nicely.
So tell us about your years of public school teaching. What grade levels, what subject areas were you mostly focused on? Tell us about that experience.
I like that question, and I think people are a little bit surprised. Because I was a special ed teacher, my bachelor's degree was kind of eclectic. I studied English and I studied biology. I was also very comfortable teaching mathematics. So I was teaching English from 9th through 12th grade. I was teaching biology, physics. I supported in the chemistry classroom. I did algebra 2, and my favorite of my subjects, I think, was geometry. I got to teach it because I got to teach the things that people didn't want to teach.
And you taught in several school districts, quite different school districts throughout the state of Virginia. Could you share a little bit about what some of those differences were among those districts?
Interesting. I've taught in Spotsylvania County, Stafford County, and Fairfax County, and Falls Church City. Spotsylvania was a bit of a challenge for me. I had started in Stafford County, so I was that parent who used to be on the PTO. I had been the president and the treasurer of the PTO, so I knew the school system pretty well, and I worked within the schools. But then when I moved to Spotsylvania, it was a very different culture than the Stafford culture. So I had to get accustomed and adjust to very different practices. My students would come to school prepared to leave as soon as possible so they could go hunting in order to provide food for their family. I mean, that to me was something very new and unusual. So it gave us things to talk about, and they were teaching me, which children really love when they can teach adults. Then I moved from Spotsylvania to Fairfax. Huge school system. I felt that I was just like a drop in the bucket. Our school was very large, and again, a completely different culture of children. Much more, to me, it felt much more urban than what I had been experiencing. And that was a nice learning curve. I got to meet children and again have them talk with me about their experiences that were very different than my Stafford and Spotsylvania experiences. And then, wonder of wonders, miracle of miracles, I got to work in Falls Church City. What an amazing school system. I loved everything about it. I loved that the schools were small, that the children didn't have a competitive attitude because there was only one school at each level at that time. So I only had, the children just had a very strong community that they were part of. And they felt invested and loved their community. So that was my public school experience.
Yeah, and you told me when we connected in person recently that your experience in Falls Church, Virginia, was what really started you thinking about the benefits of small schools
Hmm.
and more of that kind of intimate, nurturing environment that, of course, you've
Yes.
gone on to create in your own microschool at Grand Magnolia. Before we talk about where you are now and your vision for Grand Magnolia, I want to rewind a little bit as well. You yourself went to public schools as a child. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that experience growing up. What was your education like?
See, I was born in Washington, D.C. So I went to a public school, a very interesting elementary school. I lived in Northwest Washington, so I had the pleasure and joy of going to school with many embassy children. Um, I just was so exposed to a variety of cultures. We would have experiences with their food and their clothes and just it was phenomenal experience. John Eaton Elementary School. Unfortunately, my middle school, junior high school experience wasn't so great. I went to Alice Deal, and I found it to be frightening environment, to say the truth. Um, what they had done with Alice Steele, and I realized I was a child, so I don't know everything about it. But my impression, based on my expertise now, is that they bused children who came from very different backgrounds. So they integrated us into a school, but they didn't give us the tools to enjoy each other and appreciate each other. So it felt very hostile to me. It was an us and them situation. Maybe maybe even borderline gang like situation where I found myself running from one classroom to the next because I didn't know what was going to happen as I was changing classes. And then my parents moved to Potomac, Maryland. Oh my goodness. Uh, much different environment. Um, uh, Everything that you could possibly imagine was available. I remember loving and taking golf classes during gym and archery classes with real arrows. I couldn't believe we had bows and arrows. I had a horse, and one of my courses taught me how to care for the horse. I mean, that's Potomac, Maryland. And I graduated from Winston Churchill High School in Potomac, Maryland. So I've had a pretty broad experience as a student.
Yeah, and tell us a little bit more about your parents. They had fascinating lives and careers. Your father was a physician, your mother was a nurse, and they instilled in you some really strong values that you sort of take with you today, not only in kind of valuing and centering family and children, but also sort of your entrepreneurial spirit. I wonder if you could share a little bit more about them.
My father moved from Charlottesville to Washington, D.C. He was an amazing person for his time, in that, and again, I was a child, and they didn't talk a lot about what they were doing and why they were doing it. We just experienced it, and we were the beneficiaries of their hard work and labor. My father opened a bank for Black professionals to have a place where they could not only put their money and invest in businesses, but they could borrow without a lot of the prejudices that existed in the time. They also had Freedmen's Hospital, where the Black physicians could come together and offer good medical care to people of color. In Washington, D.C., Freedman's Hospital. And he was a very active participant in anybody's business. Anyone who wanted to open a business, I remember he bought a used car business and supported the person as they bought the cars that were going to be on their lot. He just believed that the best way to make life better was to invest in it. And my mother was always active with PTO. She was a person who let the school system know that she knew what she was doing. She had been a public health nurse, she had been in the army, and she knew how to make things happen. And she and my father were an amazing team for us to watch. Though they never sat down and specifically said, these are the things you need to do in order to be happy, in order to be successful. They always supported us in all of our activities and in our education. And and it was an amazing childhood for me.
And kind of now moving closer to your raising your grandchildren, or helping to raise your grandchildren as your daughter works full time as a professor, you decide that you're going to leave teaching after a couple of decades and open a daycare center down in Atlanta, where she was working at the time, for your grandchild, your oldest grandchild. What was that like, opening a licensed daycare center? Not something I assume you had done previously. What was that process?
And without a mentor, if I were to go through this again, I would have listened to your podcast and found many mentors in order to give us some idea. But fortunately, my daughter's brilliant, and we had the support of the Agnes Scott College. And so the hardest thing, I think, for us, well, probably not the hardest, but one of the hardest things was finding a location. But when we made a proposal and submitted it to Agnes Scott College, they gave us a home, and we rented a home from them. And that's where we started our homegrown micro school. At that time, I didn't even know that that's what it was. I knew that we didn't want it to be too large, because I had learned from Falls Church City that the children needed to be in a setting where they could be attended to, they could have a voice, they could be heard and could be seen, and that things didn't slip through the cracks. Um, but the licensure process is ridiculous. I have a doctorate in education, and I'm talking with people about setting up a school. And instead of them being encouraging and supportive, I found like they were setting up obstacles for me. Things as ridiculous as my home was a 2-bedroom house, um, one level and an attic. And they wanted me to put in all of these different fire systems, because they heard daycare and they immediately thought, you're going to have to go through this list. They didn't use creative problem solving. And it was very uncomfortable. And fortunately, Janelle is a lot more um, um, confident and comfortable with dealing with the systems. And so she helped me to be patient and to support setting up the school, despite the fact that there was every obstacle you could possibly imagine. I felt like right from the start, um, just makes it too difficult. It shouldn't be that difficult.
I agree. It shouldn't be that difficult. But you were able to pass along the daycare to one of your colleagues there when you
Yes.
left Atlanta to come back to Virginia, this time to Richmond, where your daughter got, again, a tenure track faculty position at the University of Richmond. And now your two grandchildren were older, kind of moving past daycare age. So you were able to open a home-based microschool and avoid kind of the daycare licensing challenges that you went through in Georgia. But I know that when we spoke, you said that as difficult as Georgia's early childcare licensing
Ah,
laws are, Virginia's are even worse. What did you discover there?
oh, I I just cannot imagine how they feel that's in the best interest of our children to put a process in place. First off, it's not even presented as a process. At least in Atlanta, I could print out the 62-page document and learn how to set up a system. Here, there's a couple of people who they refer to by name that you have to speak with. And it didn't feel as though we were always being heard, because you may call one day and speak with someone and get to a certain point, and then you call the next day and you're talking with someone else and you have to go back to square one. But again, Dr. Pfeiffer is really good with systems, and she doesn't mind sitting down and reading the material and just figuring out, deciphering the code. And again, it just doesn't make sense to me. The system, I have a doctorate in education, and it should be, oh, you want to open a school? Thank you. But it
Yes.
doesn't work that way.
Yes, yes. But despite that, you did open the Grand Magnolia School. It doesn't have the daycare component to it because, again, your grandkids are older, and that was always the intent, is to build
Hmm.
something that was really going to work for them and bring others in your community along.
Hmm.
So, what was the process of finding space and beginning to launch Grand Magnolia in Richmond?
Oof. We, I knew that I wanted a home. I didn't want to have a space that was uncomfortable. I wanted the children to feel like we were an extension of a homeschool type mentality. So we started looking at houses. We got a realtor, and I guess we must have put offers on maybe eight homes before we found the one that we're in. Um, and not for lack of trying, and I'm not sure exactly why it was such a struggle, but it was a major struggle. And I believe what we did on this home that we're in right now is we wrote a letter to the owners, and we told them what I was trying to do, and leaned heavily into the fact that I was opening a school for my grandchildren, and that I was looking to give the same type of grandmother type educational experience to other people's children, eight of their best friends. And I guess the letter impacted the owners, and they even accepted our offer, though it wasn't the best offer, the highest offer. But I think they liked the thought of their home that was special to them being used in such a manner that we had planned and decided we wanted to use this home.
And it really is a special home. It's in a residential area. It's a freestanding single family home. You do not live there. It is specifically for the Grand Magnolia School. And that's something I think a lot of my listeners and viewers would be jealous about. One thing that Virginia has going for it is that there are areas where you're able to host a school in a residential area in a single family home. And I talked to several education entrepreneurs in the Richmond area who are doing just that. So that is one benefit that you have going for you there. And it really
Hmm.
does create that nurturing home-like
Yes.
environment that you were trying to build. Maybe you could spend a little bit of time, Dr. Somerville, talking about your curriculum philosophy and educational approach.
Okay, well, the major aspect of our environment is to provide a learning environment that we're following the children's interests and needs. every child is different. And what I did basically was I looked at the requirements that the public school education, what the requirements are for the different age groups that I'm serving. And I said, how can I present this information to this child by name? So when I'm talking to Jane about addition, I think about how old she is and the things that she has interest in. Some of our work is a worksheet because sometimes you have to do mathematics using a worksheet, but most of our learning occurs in a play-based, open, loving environment. You're counting when you're cooking, you're measuring. There's a lot of numeracy in our lives that we just take for granted. There's a lot of literacy in our lives. It amazes me when I'm driving along and the children, because we go on excursions every day, and the children are pointing out words because we've been talking about those words in class. Um, and so basically, what I try to do is I try to meet their needs by setting up lessons, and we call them learning activities. Many of our learning activities people would call crafts, but the children are talking and communicating about what they're doing, the colors they're using, how many they need of each thing, whether something's larger or smaller. There's just so much learning happening. And what I'm doing, like the duck who's on the lake paddling under the surface, I'm checking off the list of saying they've had exposure, they've either had exposure, they've had mastery, or they need some more attending to this. So when I'm doing my lessons, I'm actually thinking about, and this is the beauty of a micro school, I only have to think about 10 children. So as I'm doing that lesson, I can say so and so met the need to learn their numbers, or met the need to learn identify the different letters of the alphabet. And that's the approach that I've taken.
So all of the students are technically homeschoolers, but they are able
Yes.
to attend the Grand Magnolia School as a microschool full time,
Hmm.
as a full time schooling alternative. And you have the full day program, or I guess it goes till about 1 o'clock during the day. And then you have an after school program for students from the local community who want to
Hmm.
come and have that same kind of experience, that beautiful learning environment you've created, lovely outdoor space for the children to be outside and playing. So it's just a wonderful environment, not only for your
Well,
micro school
thank you.
students, but for your after school students. And you've recruited teachers to help
Hmm.
you to run the program. And I wonder if you can share the story of the teacher that you have now. When she found your ad on Indeed, what was her reaction?
It's quite funny. We talk about it all the time. She was a licensed teacher who had completed her first year and basically said, I can't go back and do that. I'm not that person who can go and be in this room with 24 children every day and basically torture them. I think that that's how she would put it. She felt that they were not meeting the children where they were. They were just basically going through the process of teaching to pass a test, teaching to a test. I get that. When you got huge numbers, you've got to make things happen. So she and I met, and she said she could not believe the description that we put on Indeed. So when we met and interviewed, and she started talking, and you know how the interview questions are pretty, standard. But when I first asked her, what makes you think that this is the place for you? She just was explosive with her excitement and enthusiasm of here you're doing what I think everyone should experience. She's a first year teacher. I'm a 20 plus year veteran. So it was just amazing to meet a young person who was like minded, who said children need to feel heard, seen, they need to feel relevant. It used to bother her because when she tried to support a child in learning a way other than how the teacher had presented something, she would get reprimanded because there was one way that they wanted the children to be have information presented. And with our environment, we celebrate as many different ways as you can present something. And she loves it. She's amazing. If I could clone her, I would.
So she's a newer teacher, newer to the teaching profession, and seeing sort of the standardization of the system, and then realizing that there is another way, and being so
Yes.
grateful for what you created and excited about being a part of that. You were
Hmm.
in that system for over 20 years. What did you
Hmm.
see change over that time?
Oh no, my battery's about to go out. I need to plug this in. Um, what I think I saw the most was a sadness of the children who were struggling. Are you still there?
I am,
Yes,
yes.
okay. The children who were struggling to learn and how they were asked to repeat or uh, to come to special classes because they weren't being successful. But instead of the system changing to make it more doable for them, the system just kept doing the same things and trying to get the children to adjust. Can you hold on 1 second while I plug this in? I'm sorry. All right, there we are. I am so sorry.
No
Um,
worries.
I set up several programs with students. I used to do a pancake breakfast because I realized that they had to pass an SOL and many of them were struggling.
SOL.
Standard of learning, which is a test that's given in particular coursework starting in third grade. So, can you imagine the stress and anxiety that a third grader feels in saying, I have to pass this test. And then if they don't pass it, they get rushed out of their classroom into a situation where they may be encouraged to just keep going over and over and over the same material until they can pass the test. How do they feel about themselves? It just really made me very sad. And I loved my high school students. And that's why I would start cooking. I said, if I can get them to come on Saturdays, I can present the information my way on a Saturday, and maybe they can learn the material and pass the standard of learning tests
And was that
because they can't
consistent?
graduate.
Was that consistent during the whole 20 years that you were teaching, or did you see the kind of standardization and test-based education becoming more apparent? What was sort of that trend line?
I think the biggest thing that I would say, and I haven't thought about that question, but I think the biggest thing that I would say is when I first entered education, I felt as though all of the teachers loved what they did and they did it well and they'd been doing it for years. And as my time in public school was longer, we were losing those teachers. People don't like to do things that make them uncomfortable. You're not going to find a professional who's going to continually put themselves in a situation where they're uncomfortable. So I think what really changed, the standards of learning tests didn't change, but the expectations of what percentages had to pass changed. It the number got greater because I think what they thought they were doing was meeting the needs of the parents and the community, saying, we can't accept these children not being able to pass these standards of learning tests. So you need to increase. Why don't you have 100% success? Which is kind of illogical. I mean, you're never going to have a where 100% of people are going to perform at the level that makes them always pass a test. So our numbers did increase, and the stress on teachers increased, and it's just a vicious cycle of stress and anxiety, actually.
So you have created a beautiful other way with the Grand Magnolia School that's very learner centered, focused on individual child's
Hmm.
unique needs and interests,
Hmm.
where they are, what are their strengths and
Hmm.
weaknesses, working with them, kind of bringing the curriculum to them. But I know when we talked, there it sometimes this is a hard sell, which is hard, I think, for you and I to really appreciate because we so value learner-centered education. Of course, wouldn't everybody want this sort of individualized learning model?
Thank you.
And
Yes.
yet it does seem like it's a tough sell in some cases to families. Why do you think that is?
I've been thinking about this because, as you know, my enrollment is the one thing about this process that if I could, like, if I had a genie in a bottle, that's the one thing I would change. Everything else is practically perfect for me. I don't know why I can talk with parents and have people who decide to go to public school. It's like, I have a position for you for your 5-year-old. Well, they'll say, I want my kindergartner to have more friends. 10 isn't enough for me. I want the 24 to 30, and in some cases 32. Now think about a kindergarten with 30 children in it and maybe two teachers. I can't even imagine. Um, I've also had people say, this is what they did. This was good enough for them. I've had people say that they don't want their child to be awkward. Uh, there's an awkwardness that's associated with the smaller learning environment. Oh, you've met a couple, but I would love for people to come and talk with my 4-year-olds. Uh, my 4-year-olds probably present more closer to a 6-year-old because their language skills are very, very attuned to the fact that there's an adult who loves them every day, talking with them and encouraging them to share their views, not only their views, but their emotions, full range of emotions. And they can talk intelligently about their emotions. And they're going to be such contributors to the community that hopefully someone one day will look and say, those micro school children really get it. And they get it while they're young and they're still impressionable. And we don't wait until they've gotten in trouble and we put them in the small setting just to protect the other part of the community from them. I love these children.
Well, that definitely shines through. There is absolutely nothing awkward about the children that I encountered. They're incredibly precocious, curious, energetic, enthusiastic about learning and playing and being there. So I think it is the model, hopefully, of the future of education. And I wonder if you can talk more about sort of your plans for growth. I know that you would like to boost your enrollment slightly, but you really have a cap. You want to retain that micro feel of
That's
microschooling.
right.
So you don't want to get too big, but you do want to sort of grow with your grandchildren and meet their needs and provide the best education possible for them. So what does the future of Grand Magnolia look like for you in the short term and in the longer term?
Well, in the short term, which has always been my plan, I'm going to slide my school up with my grandchildren. So as they get older, I will present them with materials that are age appropriate as they get older. As a result of talking with you and talking with my teaching staff, um, we've talked about whether or not they would like to be entrepreneurs in microeducation. So, surprisingly, and I'm very happy to say, um, one of them has already committed to, as you get past this age group, I will start a program with the younger age group and move with them as well. So she's been encouraged to follow and try to learn the business and be comfortable with presenting to parents, which is the hardest part, and to understand the micro school process. So I'm going to be mentoring her and what we would like to do. In fact, today when we went out on excursion, we saw three little houses that were looked like they were just identical to one another around the corner. And I said, see, there's the high school, there's the middle school, there's the elementary school, and the current house would be the preschool. So we've already got our eyes on homes in the neighborhood.
Oh, I love that. I love that vision of seeing a few single family homes for sale and then thinking of them as being a sort of village of micro
Hmm.
schools.
Hmm.
It really does shift our concept of education and of
Hmm.
schooling from these
Hmm.
large institutions
Hmm.
to much more community based, hyper local, learner centered, and community centered
Hmm.
places. So I just love that. I'm excited for that vision to become a reality. And great to hear that you're activating teacher entrepreneurs in your own
Yes.
community through Grand Magnolia, who can share your educational philosophy and your curriculum approach there. What advice would you give to education entrepreneurs or prospective
Mm.
microschool founders, especially those who might be like you, somebody who's been in a conventional school system for years, is looking for a
Hmm.
change? What
Hmm.
would you say if they wanted to go off and create a microschool?
Be strong. Believe in yourself. Find a mentor. There are people who will support you. Even talking with you, Carrie, and meeting with you and meeting the other people at the dinner that we had together has boosted me and my morale way out of the water. I was, because enrollment always beats me down. I might talk with 20 parents for every one child I get. I want that to change, but until it does, I've got to keep my confidence up. Um, and that's difficult to do. So find a mentor, find support system, and believe in yourself is what I think.
Great advice. And yes, you are very much a part of a much larger microschool movement and a cohort of education entrepreneurs, not only in the greater Richmond, Virginia area, but nationally as well. It's such an exciting time in education, I think, where there is more openness to alternative learning models and learner centered education, and more entrepreneurs like you who are
Hmm.
building those models. So, just really great things to come, I think. So, Dr. Somerville, if my listeners and viewers want to connect with you or learn more about the Grand Magnolia School, what is the best way for them to do that?
We have a website, the Grand Magnolia School. You go to uh, the Grand Magnolia School, or my email is info@thegrandmagnoliaschool.com. And I encourage people to look at our website, to follow our Instagram. We're working on being very strong in terms of the Instagram participation, so that people can see through our photo story. But I really think that the website is very well done, and it presents the site. You can see the space, you can see the children enjoying themselves, and to see smiles on children's faces when they're learning is a very, very joyful thing. So even if you just go in and need something, a positive boost, the Grand Magnolia School is the website to look at.
Dr. Natalie Somerville, best wishes to you on the future of the Grand Magnolia School. And thank you so much for being on the Liberated podcast.
And thank you for being here. And again, thank you for the boost that you've given to me at a time when I really needed it. And hopefully, we will get our enrollment in place and be ready for our next school year.